The rain hammered against the cemetery gates like an angry fist, each drop carrying the weight of 2 years' worth of unspoken words. David Mitchell stood before the marble headstone, his calloused hands trembling not from the October cold, but from the familiar ache that lived permanently in his chest. Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, beloved wife and mother. The stone read, but those words felt inadequate, like trying to capture the ocean in a teacup. How do you summarize a life, a love, a future that was stolen in the span of a heartbeat? The anniversary of her death always brought him here, to this place where promises were made and broken in equal measure. He could still hear his own voice from that devastating day 2 years ago, raw and desperate, as he stood beside her coffin, surrounded by the faces of everyone who had loved her. The words had torn from his throat like a battle cry against the universe itself. I will never marry again. I will never love another woman. My heart belongs to you, Sarah, and it will die with me. It was a promise born of grief so profound, it felt like drowning, a vow that seemed as natural as breathing in that moment of absolute devastation. But promises made in the depths of despair, David was beginning to learn, were sometimes the hardest ones to keep. The sound of small feet splashing through puddles broke through his reverie, and he turned to see his 6-year-old daughter Lily approaching, her blonde hair darkened by rain and her green eyes, so much like her mother's, filled with a wisdom that no child should possess. "Daddy, Jake is asking for you," she said softly, her voice carrying that careful tone she'd developed since becoming the family's little diplomat. Behind her, David could see his 4-year-old son pressed against the car window, his chubby hands creating small prints on the glass, as he watched his father with the patience of someone who had grown accustomed to waiting. The sight of his children pulled at something deep in David's chest, a mixture of fierce love and overwhelming responsibility that threatened to buckle his knees. These 2 small beings were his world now, the only reason he managed to get out of bed each morning and face another day in a world that felt permanently off balance. They were also the living proof of his love with Sarah, the beautiful legacy of a marriage that had been too perfect, too precious, too fragile for this harsh world. How could he ever risk loving someone else when love had already cost him so much? How could he possibly open his heart again when doing so might mean betraying the very foundation of who he had become? As they drove home through the winding roads of Millbrook, David caught glimpses of his children in the rearview mirror and felt the familiar tightness in his throat. Lily sat with her small hands folded in her lap, staring out at the passing fields with an expression far too serious for her age. She had been Sarah's shadow, following her mother everywhere, absorbing every lesson about kindness and grace that Sarah had to offer. Since the accident, Lily had become quiet, almost fragile, as if she were afraid that speaking too loudly might shatter what remained of their family. Jake, on the other hand, had been barely 2 when Sarah died, and his memories of her were more feeling than image, more warmth than words. He was the sunshine of their small family, but even his light seemed dimmed by the weight of what they had all lost. David often wondered if his children could sense his own brokenness, if they could feel the way he held himself together with sheer will and the stubborn refusal to let them see him crumble. The thought that his grief might be stealing their childhoods was almost unbearable, but he didn't know how to fix what felt irreparably broken. The veterinary clinic sat on the edge of town, a modest building that had been David's sanctuary and prison for the past 2 years. Work was the only place where he could lose himself completely, where the needs of the animals overrode the chaos in his mind and gave him something concrete to focus on. His patients didn't care about his personal tragedy. They simply needed his hands to heal, his voice to comfort, his knowledge to save their lives. There was something pure about that exchange, something that felt safe in a world that had proven itself to be anything but. But even there, surrounded by the familiar sounds and smells of his profession, David carried the weight of his promise to Sarah like a stone in his chest. He had built his entire identity around being her husband, and now that she was gone, He wasn't sure who he was supposed to be. The idea of loving someone else felt like a betrayal so fundamental that it threatened to shake the very foundation of his being. How could he honor Sarah's memory while simultaneously moving forward? How could he keep his promise to her while still being the father his children needed? These questions haunted him as he prepared to face another day, another challenge, another opportunity to prove that some promises were meant to be kept, no matter the cost. The morning sun cast long shadows across the clinic parking lot as David prepared for another day of routine that kept him anchored to sanity. He had no way of knowing that this particular Tuesday would be the day his carefully constructed world would begin to shift. That a woman named Emma Thompson was preparing for her first day as a substitute teacher at Millbrook Elementary. That his children would soon meet someone who would see past their quiet pain to the beautiful souls underneath. He had no idea that his promise to Sarah, made in a moment of unimaginable grief, was about to be tested in ways he never could have anticipated. As he walked toward the clinic doors, David Mitchell was still the man who had sworn never to love again, still the widower who believed that his heart had been buried alongside his wife. But somewhere in the distance, change was coming to Millbrook, and with it, the possibility that some promises were made to be broken, especially when the heart finds a reason to beat again. Emma Thompson had always believed that children were the most honest creatures on earth, incapable of hiding their true feelings behind polite facades or social expectations. That belief was confirmed within her first hour at Millbrook Elementary, when she noticed a small blonde girl sitting alone at the back of the classroom, her green eyes holding a sadness that seemed too heavy for such young shoulders. Lily Mitchell barely spoke above a whisper, completed her assignments with mechanical precision, and watched the other children's laughter as if it was something foreign, something she had forgotten how to do. Emma had read the girl's file, knew about the tragic loss of her mother 2 years prior, but seeing the real-life impact of that grief was like a punch to the chest. There was something about Lily that called to every maternal instinct Emma possessed, something that made her want to wrap the child in her arms and promise that the world wasn't always so cruel. As she watched Lily carefully organize her crayons while the other children played, Emma made a silent vow that she would find a way to bring light back into those haunted green eyes, even if she was only a temporary presence in the girl's life. The emergency call came at 2:47 in the afternoon, when the autumn sun was painting the classroom in golden hues and most of the children were engaged in art projects. Jake Mitchell had been playing on the playground when he suddenly collapsed, his small body shaking with fever and his breath coming in shallow gasps. Emma's teacher training kicked in immediately, but there was something deeper that drove her actions, a fierce protectiveness that surprised her with its intensity. She scooped the burning child into her arms, noting how his dark hair was damp with sweat and how his brown eyes, so different from his sister's, were glazed with confusion and fear. "It's okay, sweetheart," she whispered against his forehead, her voice instinctively taking on the soothing tone she had once used with her own students back in Chicago. "Miss Emma's got you. You're going to be just fine." The words came naturally, as if she had been saying them to Jake Mitchell his entire life, and something in her chest tightened when the little boy's arms wrapped around her neck with complete trust. This was what she had been missing, she realized. This primal need to comfort, to protect, to nurture. It was the same feeling she had once imagined she would have with her own children, the ones she had planned to have with Michael before the war took him away and left her dreams scattered like autumn leaves. Lily's reaction to her brother's illness revealed the depth of responsibility this little girl had been carrying. She appeared at Emma's side immediately, her small face pale with worry, but her demeanor surprisingly calm and efficient. "Jake gets sick sometimes," she explained in her soft voice, helping Emma gather his backpack and jacket. "Daddy says it's because his body is still learning how to be strong without Mommy." The statement was delivered with such matter-of-fact acceptance that Emma felt her heart break a little more. Here was a 6-year-old who had become accustomed to crisis, who had learned to be the steady one when her little brother needed comfort. As they walked toward Emma's car, Lily provided careful instructions about Jake's preferences, how he liked to be held when he was sick, which songs comforted him, how their daddy would want to be called immediately. The girl's composure was both admirable and heartbreaking, a testament to how much she had been forced to grow up since losing her mother. Emma found herself wondering what Lily's own grief looked like, how this little girl processed her own pain while taking care of everyone else's. The drive to the Mitchell house was filled with Jake's fevered mumblings and Lily's quiet directions, but Emma felt a strange sense of rightness about the situation. She had been teaching for 7 years, had dealt with countless childhood emergencies, but there was something different about this moment. Maybe it was the way Jake's small hand gripped hers with such trust, or the way Lily looked at her with something that might have been hope flickering in her green eyes. As they pulled into the driveway of a modest 2-story house with a wraparound porch, Emma noticed the details that spoke of a life interrupted, flower boxes that had once been carefully tended but now held only withered stems, a swing set that looked seldom used, windows that needed the touch of someone who cared about making a house feel like a home. The house felt like its occupants, she realized, beautiful bones carrying the weight of loss, potential for joy, dampened by grief. When Lily produced a key from her backpack with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this many times before, Emma felt a surge of protective anger toward the circumstances that had forced such independence on these children. Inside the house, Emma was struck by the careful order of everything, as if the family lived in a museum of their former life, rather than a home where children were free to make messes and memories. Photographs of a beautiful woman, with Lily's green eyes and Jake's dimpled smile were everywhere, creating a shrine to the mother they had lost. But there were also signs of a father doing his best. Juice boxes lined up in the refrigerator, cartoon bandages in the medicine cabinet, drawings hung on the refrigerator with military precision. Emma settled Jake on the couch, noting how he immediately reached for a worn stuffed elephant that Lily quickly retrieved for him. "Ellie was Mommy's favorite," Lily explained. Tucking the toy into her brother's arms, she gave it to Jake before she went to heaven. The simple statement carried such weight that Emma had to blink back tears. She found herself studying the family photos, trying to understand the woman who had left such a profound impact on these children, trying to imagine the man who had loved her enough to build his entire world around her memory. The fever broke just as David Mitchell's truck pulled into the driveway, and Emma watched through the window as a tall, broad-shouldered man emerged, his face etched with the kind of worry that comes from being solely responsible for 2 small lives. She had expected him to be grateful but distant, the way most single parents were with teachers, polite but eager to maintain boundaries. Instead, when he walked into his living room and saw her sitting on his couch with Jake sleeping peacefully in her arms, while Lily curled up beside them, something shifted in his expression. For just a moment, his carefully controlled facade cracked, and Emma saw the raw gratitude and something deeper, a longing so profound it made her chest ache. "Thank you," he said simply, but his voice carried layers of meaning that spoke of a man who had been carrying the weight of the world alone for too long. As he gently lifted his son from her arms, their hands brushed, and Emma felt an unexpected jolt of electricity that had nothing to do with the situation, and everything to do with the man whose eyes held depths of pain she recognized from her own mirror. The conversation that followed was careful, polite, but underneath the surface, Emma sensed a current of something neither of them was ready to acknowledge. David Mitchell was handsome in a rugged, weathered way, with dark hair that showed threads of premature gray and brown eyes that seemed to see everything while revealing nothing. He moved through his house with the efficiency of someone who had learned to manage alone, but there was a loneliness in his movements that called to something deep in Emma's chest. She found herself noticing the way his hands shook slightly when he touched his children, The way his voice softened when he spoke to them, the way he seemed to carry the weight of being both mother and father, with a determination that was both admirable and heartbreaking. When he asked about Jake's day, about what had triggered the fever, Emma found herself providing more detail than necessary, reluctant to break the spell of this unexpected intimacy. There was something about this man, this family, that felt like coming home after a long journey, and that realization both thrilled and terrified her. She had come to Millbrook to escape the memories of her old life, but she was beginning to wonder if she had actually come here to find her new one. The weeks following Jake's illness brought an unexpected rhythm to David's carefully ordered life, one that both comforted and unsettled him in equal measure. Emma Thompson had become a constant presence, not intrusive, but somehow essential, like sunlight filtering through windows he hadn't realized were closed. She began staying after school to help Lily with reading, her patient voice filling the empty spaces of their home with warmth David had forgotten existed. When Jake had nightmares, which happened more frequently than David cared to admit, Emma seemed to appear at just the right moment, her arms ready to provide comfort that came as naturally as breathing. David found himself watching her with his children, noting how she never tried to replace Sarah, but simply filled the gaps with her own unique brand of love. The sight of Emma reading bedtime stories, her voice doing different characters with theatrical flair that made both children giggle, created an ache in his chest that he couldn't quite name. Was this what healing looked like? Or was he betraying everything he had promised Sarah by allowing another woman to become so integral to their lives? The internal war David fought was relentless and exhausting. During quiet moments at the clinic, when his hands were busy with routine procedures, his mind would wander to Emma's laugh, to the way she hummed while making dinner, to how she had somehow coaxed Lily out of her shell and helped Jake sleep through the night. These thoughts felt like both salvation and damnation, offering glimpses of a future he had convinced himself was impossible, while simultaneously making him feel like he was cheating on a ghost. His promise to Sarah had been his anchor for 2 years, the one thing that kept him focused when grief threatened to drown him completely. But now, as he watched Emma help Jake with his shoelaces or listened to her discussing Lily's progress with the tender concern of someone who genuinely cared, David began to question whether his vow was actually honoring Sarah's memory or dishonoring her belief in love itself. Sarah had always said that love wasn't a finite resource, that it grew stronger when shared, not weaker. Would she really want him to spend the rest of his life as a monument to grief? The moment of truth came on a Thursday evening when David arrived home to find Emma in the kitchen, flour in her hair and laughter in her eyes, while his children helped her bake cookies. The scene was so domestic, so perfectly right that it took his breath away. This was what happiness looked like, he realized. Not the absence of grief, but the presence of joy alongside it. Emma turned to greet him, her smile bright and unguarded, and for the first time in 2 years, David allowed himself to imagine what it might be like to love again. The thought terrified him more than any emergency he had faced as a veterinarian, more than the darkest days following Sarah's death. But as he watched Emma wipe cookie dough from Jake's nose while Lily explained their baking process with scientific precision, David felt something shift inside him. Maybe some promises were meant to evolve, to grow into something larger than the pain that created them. Maybe love wasn't about holding on to the past, but about being brave enough to embrace the future, even when it looked nothing like what you had originally planned. Small towns have their own language of observation, and in Millbrook, the growing connection between David Mitchell and Emma Thompson became the subject of every coffee shop conversation and grocery store encounter. Margaret Harrison, David's neighbor and the children's occasional babysitter, was the first to voice what everyone was thinking during their weekly book club meeting. "That young teacher is spending an awful lot of time at the Mitchell house," she commented, her tone carefully neutral, but her eyes sharp with concern. "I'm not saying it's wrong, mind you, but those children have been through enough upheaval." The words carried the weight of community judgment, the kind of small-town surveillance that could either support or suffocate, depending on which side of public opinion you found yourself on. Other voices joined the chorus, some supportive, recognizing that David deserved happiness, others protective of Sarah's memory, worried that change might somehow diminish the love that had been lost. The pressure of being watched, evaluated and discussed became another layer of complexity in David's already conflicted heart. Sarah's sister, Jennifer, made the 3-hour drive from Columbus specifically to address what she called the situation. Her arrival at David's doorstep carrying the force of family obligation and protective fury. "Sarah hasn't even been gone 3 years," she said, her voice tight with emotion as they sat on the porch after the children were asleep. "How can you even think about replacing her?" The accusation hung in the air like a physical weight, and David felt the familiar guilt crash over him with renewed force. Jennifer had Sarah's eyes but none of her warmth, and her words cut deep precisely because they echoed his own deepest fears. "No one could ever replace Sarah," he replied quietly, but even as he spoke the words, he wondered if allowing Emma into their lives was somehow diminishing his late wife's importance. The conversation that followed was painful and necessary, full of tears and accusations, memories and regrets, ending with Jennifer's ultimatum that if he chose to move forward with this teacher, he would be dishonoring everything Sarah had meant to their family. The weight of community and family pressure began to affect his children in ways David hadn't anticipated. Lily became quieter again, sensing the adult tensions swirling around their home, while Jake clung more desperately to Emma during her visits, as if he feared she might disappear like his mother had. Emma herself began to pull back, recognizing the impossible position she had unknowingly created. "Maybe I should transfer to another school," she suggested one evening, her voice careful and controlled. "I never meant to cause problems for your family." The offer was generous and selfless, exactly what David had come to expect from her, but it also crystallized something important in his mind. Running away from gossip and family pressure wasn't protecting his children, it was teaching them that love was something to be ashamed of, that happiness was somehow disloyal to grief. As he watched Emma gather her things, preparing to step out of their lives to make things easier for everyone else, David realized that some battles were worth fighting, even when the entire world seemed to be watching and waiting for you to fail. The rain against the classroom windows mirrored the storm brewing in David's chest as he found Emma packing up her teaching supplies, her movements precise but heavy with resignation. She looked up when he entered, her eyes reflecting a sadness that made his heart clench. "You don't have to do this," he said, his voice rougher than intended. "You don't have to leave because of what people are saying." Emma set down the stack of papers she'd been organizing and turned to face him fully, her expression a mixture of pain and determination. "Yes, I do, David. Your children don't need the chaos I've brought into their lives. They've already lost enough." Her words were selfless, but David could see the hurt beneath them, the way she was willing to sacrifice her own happiness for the sake of his family's peace. It was exactly the kind of gesture that had made him fall for her in the first place, and exactly why he couldn't let her walk away without knowing the truth about what she meant to all of them. "I need to tell you something," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper, "about why I really came to Millbrook." She moved to the window, staring out at the rain, as if gathering courage from the storm. "I was engaged once to a man named Michael. He was a soldier, deployed to Afghanistan just 2 months before our wedding. He never came home." The words fell between them like stones into still water, creating ripples of understanding that reached deep into David's soul. "I know what it's like to make promises to someone you'll never see again," she continued, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. "I promised Michael I would never love anyone else, that I would spend my life honoring his memory. For 3 years, I kept that promise. I threw myself into teaching, moved from city to city, convinced myself that loving again would be a betrayal of what we had." She turned to face David, tears streaming down her cheeks. "But then, I met your children, And then I met you, and I realized that love isn't about replacement or betrayal. It's about honoring the capacity for love that the people we've lost taught us to have. The revelation hit David like a physical blow, not because it was painful, but because it was so perfectly, completely understood. Here was someone who knew the weight of impossible promises, the guilt of moving forward, the fear of dishonoring the dead by choosing to live. "Emma," he whispered, crossing the room to take her hands in his, "what would Michael want for you? What would he really want?" The question hung between them, carrying all the weight of their shared grief and hope. "He would want me to be happy," she admitted, her voice breaking. "He would want me to love and be loved. He would probably be furious that I wasted 3 years being afraid." David nodded, understanding flooding through him like sunlight after a storm. "Sarah would want the same for me," he said, the words feeling like a key turning in a lock he hadn't realized was there. "She would want our children to know what a loving family looks like again. She would want them to see that love doesn't end with death. It expands." The storm that hit Millbrook 3 weeks later was the kind that reminded everyone how small they were against nature's fury, with winds that bent trees like blades of grass and rain that turned streets into rivers. The community center became a refuge for families whose homes had lost power or suffered damage, and David found himself working alongside Emma to coordinate emergency veterinary care for displaced animals while she organized activities to keep frightened children calm. Watching her comfort a little girl whose cat had gone missing, David saw the natural mother she was meant to be, the way she gave her whole heart to every child who needed her. When Jake slipped on the wet floor and scraped his knee badly enough to need stitches, Emma was there before David could even turn around, holding their son, because that's what Jake had become, their son, while David worked with steady hands to clean and close the wound. "You're being so brave, sweetheart," she whispered into Jake's hair, and David felt something click into place, like a bone that had been dislocated finally finding its proper position. The moment of absolute clarity came when they finally made it home near midnight, exhausted but united in a way that felt both new and ancient. Lily and Jake had fallen asleep in the car, and as David carried Lily while Emma took Jake, he was struck by how natural it felt, how right this division of labor was between parents who loved the same children. Inside the house, as they tucked the children into bed together, Lily stirred and reached for Emma's hand. "I'm glad you didn't leave," she whispered, her green eyes serious and wise. "Mommy would like you. You make Daddy smile again, and you make our house feel happy." The simple statement from his daughter was like a benediction, a permission he hadn't realized he'd been waiting for. Emma's tears were immediate and honest, and David knew in that moment that his daughter had just given them the greatest gift possible, the blessing of the past on their future. Later, as they sat on the porch listening to the storm's retreat, David took Emma's hand and felt the last of his resistance crumble. "I want to ask you something," he said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to say. "But first, I need you to know that loving you doesn't diminish what I had with Sarah. It honors it. She taught me how to love completely, and that gift doesn't die with her." Emma nodded, understanding shining in her eyes. "Emma Thompson," he continued, dropping to one knee despite the puddles on the porch. "Will you marry me? Will you be Jake and Lily's mother? Will you help me show them that love multiplies, it doesn't divide?" Her yes was immediate and fierce, accompanied by tears and laughter, and a kiss that tasted like new beginnings. As they held each other in the aftermath of the storm, David realized that some promises were made to be transformed, not broken. His love for Sarah would always be part of him, but it had grown large enough to encompass Emma and the beautiful life they would build together, proving that the heart's capacity for love was infinite when it chose courage over fear.